This is Mrs. Schultz, and in this video, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to the Northern Renaissance. We've been talking about the Renaissance as it's been centered primarily in Italy and Southern Europe, and there was another Renaissance that took place a bit after that one in the northern part of Europe, particularly the area called Flanders at the time, which included Holland or the Netherlands and Belgium. And there we go. Sorry. So Renaissance art in Northern Europe was influenced by Italy, but it was really quite different in the way that you'll see differences in some of the paintings and in the reasons for the Renaissance. So in Italy, we saw the Renaissance was inspired by new findings of the writings and art from classical Greece and Rome. In Northern Europe, change was driven by changes in religion in Europe, a return to Christian values, and a revolt against the authority of the church, which you'll see more about when we study the Reformation. In Northern Europe, more princes and kings were patrons of artists as well. In Italy, the patrons tended to be wealthy business people, like the Medicis. So the characteristics of Northern Renaissance art, they continued late medieval attention to detail, and I'll show you some examples of art in a minute. There was a tendency toward realism and naturalism and less emphasis on the classical ideal. They had an interest in landscapes and were very skilled at painting landscapes, some artists. More emphasis on middle class and peasant life. So we have a bit of a record of how people lived, maybe real people, as opposed to, like everyday people. They also had details of the insides of homes and were really skilled in making portraits of people. This is the work of Jan van Eyck, one of the more famous Northern Renaissance artists. You can see the realism and attention to human personality. This is a self-portrait here. You can see the kitty down here, some of the interior of the home, obviously a pregnant woman here with her husband. Another famous Northern Renaissance artist was Albrecht Dürer, who focused on human proportion. This is a really interesting portrait here, a self-portrait. And we were beginning to see some work from the early stages of the scientific revolution where they were observing the world around them. And this is a painting he did of a feather, or a wing, which is really extraordinary. Examples of portraits. This is from Hans Holbein the Younger, who was considered the finest portraitist of his day in Europe. This is a portrait he did of Henry VIII of England and Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And again, if you go back, you can see just the detail and the face and the ring and the cloak, and it was pretty extraordinary. So Christian and Northern Renaissance humanism, the belief centered on this idea that all humans can improve themselves, that reading of classical and Christian antiquity would instill true inner piety and bring about reform. They also supported, some of these Northern Renaissance humanists supported schools. They began to talk about using human reason instead of just relying on the church to tell everybody what to think. One of the most important thinkers and writers at the time was a Christian humanist named Erasmus. He was born in Holland. Educated in a school there. He traveled widely and also conversed in Latin. And the theme of his work was education as a means to reform. So education was important to the Northern Renaissance humanists. He believed that he rejected medieval religious practices, rejected external forms of religion that were promoted by the Catholic Church, like pilgrimages and fasts and sacraments. He emphasized the original meaning of the scriptures, and we'll get into that a little bit more with the Reformation. To him, church reform would come from the spreading of the philosophy of Jesus and providing early education to Christianity. His most famous work is The Praise of Folly, which sort of made fun of the Catholic Church. His reforms didn't achieve what he'd hoped for, but his moderation and emphasis on education were overwhelmed at the time by Reformation passions. and again, we'll get to the Reformation. People say that he laid the egg that Luther hatched. So he provided some of the early ideas that Martin Luther and the Reformation would run with later on. Okay, and that's it. So fill in your notes if you're filling those out with this video, and let me know if you have any questions.